When he is unveiled in 1890, there are throngs of people that arrive in Richmond. Some estimate around 100,000 people.
And the lowest voter turnout rate of any state in the Union for most of the early 20th century.
Now, after the war, schools are popping up. Freed people are learning how to read, how to write.
That's the biggest threat to white Southerners who want to control their own future.
The 1901 and 1902 Constitution is designed almost specifically to disinvest African Americans of their constitutional rights.
This convention undoubtedly has the power to provide for the restriction of suffrage as it may deem most wise and expedient.
What it does is it uses poll taxes to remove 80% of African American voters from the voting rolls.
With William Ferguson Reed, who was a surgeon, William Thornton, who was a podiatrist, John Brooks, who was very involved in NAACP voter registration efforts.
Black people vote in enormous numbers and continued to do so throughout the 1870s and into the 1880s.
Entirely. So the second part of their strategy was to make sure that African Americans could not go to the polls, that they could not vote.
And although he will receive a memorial over his tomb in Lexington, where he is buried at Washington College, soon to be renamed Washington and Lee.
And they are being outnumbered in terms of their voting power.
It belies the entire idea laid down by the Lost Cause that African Americans were unprepared for freedom. If you actually look at the sources and you look at what black people were doing after the Civil War.
States that removal essentially is off the table for localities, right? Any sort of war memorial, which also includes the Civil War.
The Negro put up the Lee Monument, and should the time come, will be there to take it down.
Specifically, the United Daughters of the Confederacy were either young children during the war or were born after the war and came of age during Reconstruction.
And in many ways, he, along with Maggie Walker and other African American leaders, really were.
African Americans were using these streetcars to travel to their jobs, and they were paying this regular price.
There's no way they would have looked at Confederate iconography as war memorials. They would have saw them for what they were.
Of lynching, this is a guy in his 20s and 30s, of a black man's arm with a big bicep holding lightning bolts, which has two men.
And there are probably no more important individuals in Richmond that lay the foundation than the Crusade for Voters.
My grandfather, he said, we need to have a crusade for voters.
In the mid-20th century, the United States embarks on a series of campaigns to update its cities, in large part because cities were built haphazardly.
Or they had been in their homes and they had dined with them, and they also had cared for people in their family. They also worshiped together.
In the United States, in large part, not because of violence, but because of the poll tax.
Making sure that people have an opportunity for civic and political participation. They were interested in jobs. They were interested in education.
Richmond has not let its eagerness to put a new gloss on its downtown dim its pride in its past. Careful planning has enabled the city to retain such noble old structures as the Confederate White House.
By using your votes wisely, voting for the right people, impossible doors will be opened.
And it wasn't as if the quest or the question was to take away monuments. The quest was to add a monument.
States that
was tennis an opportunity for you to see racism right up front?
Well, it was when I was 12 years old.
Recommending that some civil rights statues be placed on Monument Avenue. I spent 12 months in Vietnam, and those were not good days.
He started a mentoring program called Virginia Heroes with Richmond Public Schools, where we would mentor middle school students. That's how I actually met him. And when he died, Richmond struggled with how to honor him. It's a complicated legacy because how do you honor someone you rejected?
To try to play in an official sanctioned U.S. Tennis Association tournament, and I was turned down. We figured we would be, but we're going to test it anyway.
Yeah, right. He protested against the monuments of white supremacy when the first and the largest monument was going up. He probably never would have thought that his great
as soon as possible.
Around the world, people are tearing down statues honoring racist figures and wrestling with which ones should stand. You could argue that Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy, is at the center of this debate. Protesters there have toppled several statues already, and at a city council meeting today, Richmond Mayor LeVar Stoney said he wants city-owned Confederate monuments removed immediately.
After some of the horrendous homicidal events of the last 5 years from Charleston, South Carolina.
Of that kind of systemic racism in the city of Richmond. That's why they became those kind of targets, because they are symbols of the kind of brutality, white supremacy, and issues of police brutality and holding the police accountable.
2 years ago, the community was demanding change after Richmond police shot and killed a 24-year-old black man named Marcus David Peters. Peters was a high school biology teacher who appeared to be having a psychiatric episode when he was naked, unarmed, and charging police on a freeway on-ramp. Advocates called for what's called a Marcus alert system, which would make mental health professionals first responders in these cases with police as backup. Lawmakers had
the Up South market. The biggest business in Richmond was trading black people. There were dozens of dealers, traders, auctioneers, commission merchants preparing people for sale.
Was to improve blighted areas. In Richmond, it was used to try to change the racial composition of the city.